Hey guys, please, in today's episode, we have Dave Matthews, not the musician, but CRO who walks into broken sales organizations and somehow makes the magic happen. We will talk about those nail-biting moments when a private equity firm realizes, holy F, our portfolio company is hemorrhaging revenue. Sales team is demoralized and the clock is ticking on the exit. Dave is the guy they call at 2 a.m. So strap in and let the fun begin. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Two and a Half Salesmen. I'm your host Mario, together with my co-host and partner Noam, where we talk with today's leaders about all things revenue. Today's guest, Sir David Matthews, CRO at PCH. What is different about this episode is we are going to talk about turnarounds, specifically turnarounds in private equity owned company. Dave, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Dave.
Pleasure to be here, guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So, Dave, before we begin, we kind of imagine this as a three-way conversation between all three of us, but just for our audience, tell us, a little bit about your background, early influences, and kind of how did you end up where you are today? And then we will just dive straight into the topic.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for asking. I was sales management, sales leadership, sales executive. I started out in the billion-dollar companies, the big NBC Universals and Univisions of the world. And basically, I was always uncomfortable with status quo. I was always really interested in what's next and making a bigger difference. I don't know if that's based on insecurity or paranoia, but I was always very interested in how can I be different and do something that's a little more unique than what everyone else is up to. So that kind of got the party started for me on trying to have incrementality and added value versus being replaced by a monkey.
Awesome. And how, I am really curious, how did how did you specialize in being a turnaround CRO? That's not uncommon because everywhere, on LinkedIn, in people's blogs, everywhere, just people are asking growth, right? But what you do is really, really specific, right?
Yeah.
Turnaround. Distressed companies in problems, you come in and you kind of you hug them. I'm guessing your hug is really, really nice.
Kind of a slap hug, really.
Slap hug. So how did you get into being? Was that on purpose? Did you see an opportunity, or just you kind of had a knack for
No, I wish I was that smart. I'm not a multiple PhD private equity big brain specialist at all. I did not choose that road. I literally ended up in a couple of distressed situations and was lucky enough to have good outcomes. So although every one of us has a little bit of an imposter syndrome, I think I got a reputation that I didn't deserve as being really good at turnarounds. Eventually, I got more comfortable with it. I kept getting work because of it, and I literally figured it out along the way, and it ended up working. But I think I'm more lucky than good when it comes to the outcomes that I've had.
I would say you give yourself too little of a credit.
Yeah, I'm sure about that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I got better. I think now I'm pretty specialized. And I'm not good at a lot of things, but I'm actually really good at this. But I didn't start out good at this.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's an honest feedback. Something funny come to my mind. I remember that back in the old days, I was working for Oracle, and we were two sales account manager handling an account that was supposed to be, then decided who will handle it. But both of us were kind of, generous with each other. We were not fighting with that. But we're two good salespeople, you could say. We really worked good together. At one point, the other guy said, to the audience, well, I want you to meet Noam. He's actually the doctor when it comes to this specific. Oh, well, I was like, okay, that's great. The presentation went well. The account, materialized and everything was fine. A couple of months later, suddenly someone is, I'm in the supermarket. Someone is approaching and say, "Hey, doctor, can I ask you a question?" And suddenly I became a doctor and I don't have a PhD. At that point, I was like, should I tell him that that's not the case, or should I just
Should I
leave
tell
it
him I'm
as it
not
is?
that type of a doctor?
Yeah, I was hoping he wouldn't ask for a knee problem or something like that. But
That would be bad.
yeah.
Yeah, it's funny reference that you use though, because one of the keys to this, which is apparently more unique than it should be, is a lot of revenue leaders are about execution,
Hmm.
as we all should be, because it really is about outcomes. But there's a really important phase that I find most miss, which is the diagnosis phase. So it's interesting you said doctor, because salespeople get promoted and they become sales managers and sales
Yeah.
executives, and everyone wants a CRO title. So it's one of the few professions where you could have a really fluffy executive title and not necessarily be competent in that role,
Yeah.
which is really about diagnosis, prescriptive recommendations, business planning prior to execution. So it's funny you
True.
said doctor, because it's like being a revenue doctor.
Yeah. Well, that was actually my first question. What is the fundamental difference between running a GTM motion in a whatever startup, pre-series A, series A, series B, series C, and a turnaround, right? So when you go in, and I've led both, series A and series B as a CRO. It's okay, this is where we are, this is where we need to be, this is the resources that I have, let's go. But my guess, it's a little bit different when you come in a like a distressful situation, especially in the private equity, right? Private equities have what, 7 to 10 year the investment period in the company, and they are looking for an exit, right? So increase value, exit. So what would you say is is it you first get in with the diagnosis, or what would be like the fundamental difference between the two?
I would knock over two old ladies for a 7 to 10 year runway. I usually get brought in when it's about 18 months left. So I'm jealous of the 7 to 10 year runway, but that's their runway, not my runway.
Yeah, no, well, I meant the private equity runway.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I'm stealing the data from somebody that I worked with once. I can't take the credit for it, but here are some numbers that I heard, if it helps set up this
Yeah.
segment. So we were at lunch once, we were 2 martinis in, and the story from a private equity leader said, here's the real deal with sales leaders. And I was like, oh boy, here we go. He said 98%, this is just the good ones. This isn't everybody. 98% of the really good sales executives are executing a plan that's been given to them, and they execute it really well. 98%. He said only 2% have vision. And I remember specifically saying, how do you define vision? And he said, the ability to see what something could be versus what it is. Only 2% of the best have vision. And then he said, only 1% know how to take that vision and put it into some form of a business plan to then go get the resources needed to execute on that vision. So I have some very visionary friends in this business, but once I heard that story, I realized they are visionary, but they don't know what to do with that.
Mm.
So if you do have the vision, and according to his data, it's 2%, but the 1% can take that vision and put it into some kind of a business plan and then pitch the board, their CEO or their boss, on their vision to get the necessary resources to then go execute on that plan. You got to have the right person before the situation even materializes, because if someone is really good at executing, but they don't have vision, they're probably not the best fit in a CRO role in a turnaround. So that's a start. And not to bore you to death with too long a story, but I also think there's three paths. So if you do have the right person, I think there's three completely different paths. Everybody's obsessed about what company they want to work for, but director's view versus actor's view. If you back up a little and it's not about the company, there's really three paths. There's the billion-dollar company path, the startup path. And those are the only two I knew about when I was coming out of school. Nobody explained these paths to me. And then when I was around 40 and I got recruited into the private equity world, I was introduced to the third path, which is the advanced startup world. And who cares and why does it matter? It matters because the three paths have extremely different needs. Even though the titles might be the same of the job that you have, a billion-dollar company is like a protect and defend strategy. A startup is about marketplace validation. The board just wants to make sure that what they've created, anybody really gives a about it.
Yeah.
But an advanced startup isn't as interested in marketplace validation anymore. An advanced startup already got the validation. That's how they got to 20 or $25 million, even up to 100, I would say. And in an advanced startup, they don't want someone to help validate the market. They need scale. So it's cool to think about what company you want to work for, but I think it's really important to know what you're good at. And like a doctor, what's the need that you're trying to satisfy, and is it a good fit for you or not? So I happen to be a better fit with advanced startups. I'm not that great with startups, but advanced startups I'm pretty solid with. So that, I don't know if that's too long of an answer to your question, but I think vision is very necessary in putting into some form of a plan, which includes a diagnostic phase. And for me, it's got to be scaling. For others, it's marketplace validation. And for other people, it's a protect and defend strategy for billion-dollar companies.
Yeah, which is a different ballgame.
Totally different ballgame.
Yeah.
Norm, you and I talk whenever we coach, CROs and VP
You mean
sales.
we argue? You mean we argue?
We argue.
Yeah.
We argue. Yeah. It's the not the chicken and egg. I can't find the right words, but sales leaders, revenue leaders get stuck in doing day-to-day work. So I call it optimizing the present versus building a future.
Yeah, the future, yeah.
Right. So that's kind of where they stuck. And whenever we begin, and I was mentored, and he's a good friend of mine, Robert Hargrove from Boston. He talks about the impossible future, right? And I always say, to your point, Dave, what's the vision? What's that big hairy audacious goal? What's that impossible future? What is that something that if achieved will make tremendous difference? And usually these guys, they just want to go through the day. So Norm, how do you handle those?
Well, I think if it's let's say the management or leadership, the company leadership that is in focus for this question right now.
Yeah.
Right? Because who are you asking for? I think it's also complements what Dave was saying. When it comes to, let's say, standard growth, okay, let's call it standard growth, then typically people such as me, you, Mario, right? We're being called upon because maybe they want to grow faster at a faster pace, but there's the market validations, their plan in place, but most of them are stuck with some kind of, let's say, of bumpers or blocks or whatever with the execution. So they need someone, I would even say aggressive, I call it the Terminator, right? Someone that waltzes in, got a lot of power, a lot of authority, and then they need someone to execute, as Dave said, but it's already, the plan was already there. And if it's not 100% fixed, let's say it's even a 60, 80% fixed, or prepared. They need someone just to fix it. And that I would say it's the typical executor that I would say that these leaders are looking for. And we know it. We know we talk to them. They're always on the hunt for someone that can execute like a mean machine. Okay, someone that never gets tired, is always available. And then, but that's I would say that's the main thing. And by the way, every program that we work with companies, this is the theme. Okay, so there's numbers, there are goals, and I wouldn't say there's no vision in there, but the vision factor is significantly reduced. It's not about
Yeah.
the impossible future, it's about the possible outcome, it's about the numbers, it's
It's about
about
day to day.
yeah, but it's also, if you think about it from let's say from a financial market perspective, they've got the investors, there's projections and forecasts, and it's not about creating suddenly something boom boom. Okay, it's stand up to the expectations. You can given you can go beyond, but no more than that. But what Dave represents, I would say it's a different doctrine, right? It's a different ally, it's a different corridor, and that's a different speciality, which for me is super exciting. But that's not what, Mario, you and I usually work with on a day-to-day
And
basis.
also, what you're describing is actually very exciting, but it's a gigantic assumption that the plan you're executing is correct.
Correct. And if I may say, I don't think that most of the executors that we work with, and some of them are really good, I don't think they even doubt if the plan is good or not good. It
That's where,
is, you know what I'm saying? It's like, is there a plan
oh,
place? Yeah. Okay,
I've
good.
been there. Unfortunately, I had to learn by failing. That's where the diagnostic phase comes in, because it really isn't about like, Siri, it's not false modesty, but who gives a shit about my opinion? It's really not about my opinion or what I think. I rely on the data. And the data, the diagnostic phase that I do, it's like reading a novel when I get the data, because
Yeah.
I got to tell you, probably 9 out of 10 times it took forever to get it because no one's asked for it in that way before. And every CEO has a great narrative that they tell the board and the marketplace, and they talk about it when they're on stage. I have yet to be in a situation where the CEO's narrative matched the data that I came up. So this diagnostic phase, it takes a while, but when you get it, it's like reading a book. I mean, look, data is not sexy to everybody, so it's not a
Yeah.
fun phase, but the data doesn't have its own opinion. It just speaks for itself. And it's like reading a book. It explains everything. Even sometimes it's a really bad story, but it explains everything. So I like that phase because the data, when you have it lined up properly, it explains pre-sale, sale, post-sale. It explains all of it. So that usually is when you have to go back to the board with your, not just the diagnosis, but you have to have prescriptive recommendations based on the diagnosis. If you don't, it's just recommendations based on what you did at your last company or the company before that. And a lot of boards want a ferocious cheerleader who's going to come in and, yes, we're going to hit that number. And of course, we're going to do that. And I'm going to either fire people or make it happen and be a driver of outcomes. But that's assuming it's the right plan. I mean, imagine if you went to a doctor and the doctor said, don't tell me, I'm going to give you what I gave my last 5 patients. You would never go back to them.
Yeah, I use the same example. Here are 79 pills, one will work.
Yeah, but it's true. It's true.
And if the prescriptive recommendations don't match the current recommendations or the narrative, then you need to go through that phase before you take the job.
So,
Because
sorry, please, Dave.
well, how the board and the exec team responds to the prescriptive recommendations is really important, because
That's
the smartest people will change their opinion based on the data, and the most challenging people I've worked with will change the data to suit their opinion.
or we'll tell the analyst that they're wrong.
Exactly. I'm
So
sorry, I interrupted you, Brad.
no, it's all good. I want to build on that. I always give this example. I would never say what company it was, but it's here we are. It's about I think it was 6,000 salespeople on a call. It wasn't a Zoom. It was back in the old days. It was what was it? The video platform, uh, an oldie,
Yeah.
WebEx.
Webex.
Yeah, yeah. So it was they do the professional WebEx, and then there was about six. You had to use the video, and then the landline was you using to go in a call, whatever. And then
Oh my
suddenly, I don't
God.
know what happened to me, but I was starting to be creative, and suddenly I was suggesting stuff, and so and then the global VP said something like, hush, hush, like who the fuck are you? And just remind you who are you? And then he simply said, excuse me, whoever you are, your job is not to think. Your job is to execute exactly what I'm telling you to do. And here I am continuing until I got muted, right? So they muted me. And then I got a call from my boss saying, shut the fuck up. Okay, you're turning into red right now. So you're on red. So here's the thing. Everything in sales is about how aggressive or fast and furious are you when it comes to executing your plans. Take a look at the typical QBR. Nobody's even judging or taking any position to criticize or to challenge the plan. None whatsoever. You can have, you can plan, but the plan is the execution plan about, the narrative or the story. So here's my question, and that's, since it's like you're doing this part and you're not completely not looking the other way, which is, the narrative and what's behind the numbers, Dave, what would you say the way to handle the leadership or you could say the board? Because when it's this side, you don't deal with the leadership. You might deal with the leadership or the board, but it's about the execution. It's about the resources that you need to execute the plan. It's about how good you are. And take a look at usually how those presentations look like. There's never a slide about what's my ask from the board to execute the plan. It's about how well can I manage everything with no resource, not whatsoever. And this side completely is like a new, it's super exciting for me. So what's the way to handle, the board on this side? How do you do that? What tools or techniques or tactics or strategies are you using? Your friends and colleagues that, you may say about that. This is, I'm sure, things that, listeners for this podcast would definitely be interested in.
Well, I don't do it the way I used to, that's for sure. So I was, unfortunately back then, I wanted them to like me and respect me, and
Mm,
I didn't want to cause any problems. And I was the 98% going along with the plan, trying to execute it better than someone else could execute it. And that's how I learned the hard way. So this whole diagnostic phase started, and then that's why I do this very early. I do it unapologetically. I do it as warmly as possible, but I bring the data in very understandable assembly line type of format. Because what I hear the majority of the time is sales team needs to be better, needs to sell more.
yeah, fix it.
There's a lack of understanding of
Fix the sales team. Yeah.
there's a lack of understanding on how many machines are actually a part of that assembly line, and they have very different functions, although they are interconnected. And if one machine is not efficient or even on fire or not turned on, it affects the outcomes. So that's a whole education process I have to go to. If they don't like that, that's fine. I'm not for them. I'm okay with that now. It's like dating. It's if you're not for somebody, that doesn't bother me at all. So I go through that phase warmly but unapologetically with boards and exec teams, and it's all about how they handle a prescriptive diagnosis. I also, very funny anecdote, one thing I've heard a disproportionate amount of the time is the narrative that the client, the marketplace loves us. Agencies love us, clients love us. We just need more. We just want net new. We just need to supersize what we're currently doing. And when I get I'm like, I love that. Scaling's great. And then I do the diagnosis, and what I find out is they have renewal. I had a company, the renewal rate was 34%.
Ouch. So
I brought this to them and I said, what do you think your renewal rate is? And they said 98%. I said, 98%? You're not even a SaaS organization. How do you determine what your renewal rate is? They said, oh, if we do business with agency A as an agency.
Yeah.
And then I look back, in the next year, and if we do 98% of what we did with that agency. Now they could have lost $27 million worth of accounts, but they got 25 million more. They consider that a renewal rate.
Yeah.
So then we had to dig into, okay, well, your renewal rates are actually 34%. So why are brands not renewing with you, and what's the issue? Because you can grow. By the way, it's not the end of the world. If your renewal rates are terrible, but your net new is strong, you can still grow.
Yeah.
Well, you can survive for a bit.
You can grow, but not scale. Or and the reverse, and the reverse is also true. If your renewals are fantastic and your net new sucks, you can grow. But you can't scale doing one or the other. Scaling, to me, my simple definition of scaling is a strong renewal base, which puts you on even ground at a minimum. And you can also renew and do incrementals with your renewals, so you're actually above ground. And then you pile net new on top of that. So you have renewals plus incrementals plus net new. That's scaling.
That's scaling, yeah.
But you can't scale with a 34% renewal rate.
No. I am curious, when you do your diagnostic phase, again, whenever Noam and I begin coaching executives for the first time, we talk about the first 90 days, first 100 days. So what are your let's say first month, second month, third month like? So 30, 60, 90 days. What do those look like after you do the initial diagnostic of what is happening?
Sure. So great question, but my answer is not going to be great. So it dramatically depends. It dramatically depends on what the diagnosis said. Like if you have a cold or, you have a serious illness, it's going to be different. So it really depends on the situation. If a company is if the machines in the assembly line are all working to some degree, it's usually about turning dials and scaling without having to fix any of the machines. That's within a 90-day. You can see some improved outcomes within 90 days, particularly lead indicators, not necessarily lag indicators. But from outreach to meeting counts, you can see some of that, to even proposals, that can increase. But lag indicators, neither case, much is going to happen within 90 days.
I assume the answer would be the standard consulting answer, which is it depends. I have a good buddy. He does quote unquote digital transformation in corporates, and he named his agency It Depends.
That's really fun.
That's cool. That's cool.
I've never been in a situation where they had a realistic timeline of improved outcomes.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of which, you have your private equity partners, right? You have your CEO, you have your, marketing/sales leadership, you have your client success, and then you have product. And then kind of in the middle of everything, not the CEO. I think this is, people think it's the CEO who is in the middle. No, it's the CRO who is in the middle of everything. So how do you juggle what the private equity need? Well, what is the mandate? Because if you talk with the GPs, for the listeners who are not familiar, GPs are general partners. General partners do have fiduciary duty to everyone else. So there's a duty to the shareholders of the private equity. And you have the CEO who, CEO has its own, I would say hopefully aligned with with where the company needs to go. And then, product has its own vision, sales marketing has its own client success. And then you in the middle. So how do you juggle all of these?
Good question. So just throw some potentially boring data at you. So the change management bell curve is fascinating to me. So about 13%, about 13% of people, I don't care if there's 10 people in a room or 1,000, 13% are early adopters. They love new people, new ideas. They love change. If you're the new person with new ideas, they're nodding, they're leaning forward. They're your biggest fan. They're like, thank God that person's here. We love this new person. But before your ego could even enjoy that moment in time, there's almost the same exact amount of rejectors. So it's around 11%. Rejectors will quite literally sabotage what you're trying to. They don't like change. They don't like new people. They like things the way they've always been done.
What's an example of a sabotage? And just on top of your head, what pops into your head?
Well, what it looks like is normally arms crossed, legs crossed, leaning back, not unless they're cold, which is a factor. Head shaking. We've been through 6 CROs, been there, done that. They like to do things the way it's always been done, and they're not on board. And when you're not around, they'll find others like them, and they'll gossip around the coffee machine. And like, who's this asshole? Like, how did he get here? He's like that kind of negativity. But the interesting part is the majority of the people are in the middle, and they're what's called passive believers. And they actually like it. They're just not going to do anything about it yet. They're going to kind of wait and see. And if you think you're so charming, you're going to win over passive believers, you're going to be super frustrated. So part of the key to answer your question is, what do you do with all these different players and different roles? Is find the early adopters in every group. Recruit the early adopters who already know the passive believers, and get the early adopters to lead certain initiatives to get the passive believers to go along with them because they know each other better.
Yeah, it's the beachhead, the typical beachhead approach. Yeah, perfect. Love it.
And every board has said to me, what do you do about the rejectors? And I say, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. You get rid of them.
Yep.
Cognitive entrenchment fascinates me. It is so interesting how people will double down and amplify a losing cause of action because they don't like change.
Oh, we've seen that more often than not.
And outcome bias. If you went to a bar and you got shit-faced and you decided to drive yourself home and you didn't have an accident and you didn't get pulled over and you got home safely, people who have strong outcome bias would believe that they did all the right things and they should do it again.
Yeah.
So if you take the cautionary tales of outcome bias and cognitive entrenchment, those are 2 giant danger zones that you got to sniff out early, or you can't win in an environment like that. So double answer to your question is, there are people who are operationally sound and effective and love data. So the diagnosis helps with them because it's a data-driven
decision-making system. Yeah.
But then there are other people who are more entrenched in human behavior, either optimistic or not. And there's got to be a stronger human behavior angle to all of this, from change management to optimism. And I don't mean optimism like some bullshit, eternally positive cheerleader optimism. I'm talking about a belief that things could be better while you have a realistic version of where you are now. That's what I determine optimism to be.
Yeah.
Well, I know that we're coming close to the end of our podcast, but one question that I'd like to get a little bit more educated on is revolves around risk. And it's not about the risk of the portfolio, but the risk, I would say, how do CROs in private equity, turns out, handle the risk. just give, let me elaborate. So, Dave, you can, educate us on this. Is when it comes to, let's say, the typical revenue leaders in a typical growing company, as you say, we just want more of that, then typically the risk involved in those plans are very, very minimal. And obviously, the leaders will say there's no risk. We know what to do. It's about the execution. So there is tactical risk, but not strategic risk, or at least that the way it would look like. But when it comes to private equity, risk is a language, and risk management is a theme, right? I didn't hear anything about risk management when it comes to I need to grow the business. So, let's talk about risk management. There's no risk. Okay, or obviously there is, but there's not, you don't talk about it. So I'm, kind of super excited getting to know how do you guys, the private equity, I would say revenue leaders, how do you guys handle the risk factor that is completely inherited in business? How do you handle in the diagnostic phase, the way you handle the leadership? You know, what's your taking on this?
Yeah, very well. They have like 100 people in a basement windowless office doing risk analysis. So that's like a lot deeper than I go. But I do use the data from the diagnostic phase to present potential outcomes. I never present one outcome. So there's at least three outcomes. There's the best case, an expected. And expected is if nothing changes, is what's right. Best case is if you give me the resources that we think we need, we can have best. And then there's a worst case scenario. So I always present all three. They normally don't care so much about my opinion, but they'll take all my data from all three scenarios and plug it into their risk analysis systems. And then they come back with their recommendations, which they weigh against my recommendations for my prescription. And it's normally not, as much as they rely on the data, I would say 90% of the time, it's not about that. It comes down to how long is the runway. If the patient can be saved, it comes down to how much time do we have.
So then you could say that they're more fluctuate with the risk level of that. So it says doesn't matter the risk, but we need the patient alive. Would that be a fair statement?
Yep, very fair. And then you get into politically incorrect terms like, doging an organization and making sure the costs are in line, depending on the runway and how long will it take for the patient to be healthy, then that's a different cost analysis.
Yes.
Then you're talking about potential RIFs or reduction in force for those that don't use the term. Then you're talking about RIFs and layoffs and what do you do about costs to make sure that you are in an EBITDA positive situation while you're going along this path.
This is super exciting, Mario. Mario, take a look at that.
That's
a same profession, different job.
Completely different view and different mindset, because as they said it, he said it in the beginning, right? Sorry, Dave, for speaking in first person, but he said it in the beginning. When you have a startup, usually VC backed, growth. Let's find a market. Let's find a product market fit, whatever that is, right? And then let's get in as much revenue as possible. When it's a, big mature company, as you said, it's defend the position and try new verticals. But when you've kind of maximized, or when you've been sold, more often than not to a private equity, then there is the added layer of the, who are the investors here? Because I say this the second time, the GPs, so general partners, have a fiduciary duty to all of the investors that have invested in a private equity fund. And that's like when you're a CEO of a LLC, a limited liability company, there's a reason why it's called limited liability. With private equity, it's much more serious.
And they're, that crew is so smart. And, I'm jealous of their big brains for a million reasons, but there is a missing element typically of they don't understand collaboration enough, and they don't understand the human behavior side as much as they understand the spreadsheets. I don't know if you're a Joseph Campbell fan, but Joseph Campbell did a pretty fantastic job of documenting the hero's journey I mean, hero's journey has been around from mythology through
Long time.
Yeah.
the Star Wars movie to Harry Potter. It's this reluctant potential hero who has a call to action or a call to adventure that they resist. Think of Luke Skywalker, think of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And there was an external force telling them that they are capable of more than they're aware of. And there's the refusal to take the call to action. And then there's the crossing the threshold, which is when Luke went to the planet to train with Yoda. And it was when Harry Potter went to wherever the hell Harry Potter went to train.
Well, he went hunting for Horcruxes. That was the turnaround there. Just my geek side could not
No, I love
it.
So the part that I think private equity misses that's important is how people feel, particularly the people that work there. And as that hero's journey goes through the challenge phase is the hardest part. And it sucks. And people don't like being uncomfortable. But the reason it's actually a hero's journey and it's an incredible opportunity is those that go through it will be much more marketable and valuable after. So all these phases, whether it's the hero's journey phases or the phases of taking a company from a startup to advanced startup to banner company, most people are very comfortable in one phase. And when they get uncomfortable, they'll leave and go back to another company to repeat that phase somewhere else, which is great. You could do that for your whole career. But those that go through multiple phases, to be able to say that you took an iconic American brand from the brink of bankruptcy or even Chapter 11 and took them through those hero's journey phases and came out on the other side, where you actually saved an iconic American brand or you saved the private equity's like favorite child startup, that's where you need people who believe what you believe. The people who believe in the hero's journey, they want to be the hero. They want to fight the good fight, and they'll actually be more valuable afterwards. That's critical because not everybody's cut out for a hero's journey. And if you have people that want to repeat prior phases, they're not going to be your best assets.
I think it's. I know that we're supposed. I know, Mario. We're supposed to, end it in a minute or so. But here's the thing: there's a company here locally, which I did some work with, and they got acquired, and now they're being merged. It's the American private equity, and the sales leader was removed, and the private equity brought their own leader on board. And when I spoke with the sales, with this leader, he said, what the fuck? I know the business, I know the markets, I can do the work. Who the hell is whoever that person is? And I said to him, listen, I'm not sure you're fit to the job. And he was insulted. But I think now I should send this, the recording this podcast to this guy, who's a great guy. But it's a different job. It's same title, but it's a different job. It's a different system. It's a different belief system. And there's so many things that, Dave, you and your fellows, I would say, your bunch are doing that is so different than the typical, I would say, or let's say more common. Yeah, a more common revenue leader does, which is all, good and great, but this is so different, completely different.
That level of risk is definitely not for everybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the people who consider themselves high anxiety, there's an old study, it's a 25-year study of 10,000 people that were self-described as highly anxious. They tracked them over 25 years. The healthiest of the bunch saw situations as fascinating challenges, opportunities to learn, and adventures. And the least healthy of the bunch saw challenges as victim mentality based struggles that happened to them. It's a fascinating study. Yeah. So look, I've been in situations where I was like, holy shit, why me? Why did this happen to me? How did I land at this fucking company? Blah, 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 blah. And it takes me a couple of days. And then I'm like, you know what? This is a fascinating adventure. Yeah. I'm going to pull this off with a bunch of people who believe what we believe. And this is going to be a hero's journey. We're all going to enjoy it when we come out on the other side.
That's a very
I
strategic point
love
of
it.
view.
I love it. I love it.
It's not
So,
about resilience. It's about being strategic. Yeah. Sorry, Mario. Okay, all good. I'm
yeah.
mumbling here. Sorry about that.
So, since we are at the end, Dave, first of all, thank you so much for
Yes.
joining us here on the 2.5 Salesman. This was a fascinating look, and if fascinating conversation, and if any viewers are still watching, Norm and I are actually starting a new series that will solely focus on leaders in private equity, right? So, but that's coming sometime in June. Dave, before we let you go, one last thing. We do this with every guest. 30 seconds if you want to plug anything. Maybe you're hiring, maybe you have some cause, anything you want to plug, 30 seconds. Go.
I don't have any plugs. I'm not going to be self-indulgent, but I will say if anybody even remotely enjoyed this, I would stick with operational efficiencies and data while being equally obsessed with human behavior and the hero's journey. Do a little research on both because the combination is so powerful versus the individual parts.
Love it. Love it. To all of you watching, thank you so much for sticking with us. Norm, pleasure as always. Dave, again, thank you. And until next time, to all of our viewers, please go out and sell something. Ciao.
Yeah. Pick up the phone.
Pick
Thank you,
up the
guys.
phones.
Very grateful. Thank you both.
Thanks, everybody.